Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Community Technical Assistance Center of New York. Today's webinar is Cultural Curiosity for Youth Peer Advocates, and we have our fantastic partner and presenter here, Yasmin Baxter. She's a credentialed youth peer advocate, and she's currently the Youth Workforce Development Coordinator at Families Together in New York State. Before we get started, I just wanted to orient everyone to the webinar. Everyone should, when you log on, you should be muted, and we encourage you to keep yourself muted to avoid any background noise in case it does get unmuted, just so that everyone can kind of fully participate. We do encourage you to keep your cameras on if you can. We know many of you may be working or kind of doing other things, but sometimes having the videos on kind of makes it a more engaging experience for everybody. Please use the chat box to submit any questions, any comments at any point in time throughout the webinar. Our presenter may be able to answer some of those questions or respond to them. We may ask you to participate in discussion a few times or even unmute yourselves. We encourage as much participation as possible, both to make it a really engaging presentation, but also so that we can kind of tailor the content to meet your needs and the work that you're doing as much as possible. As you can see, the webinar is being recorded. And so the recording and the slides will be posted on the ctacny.org website within about 2 to 3 business days. And then at the end of the webinar, we will be sending out a feedback survey through the chat. There'll be a link in your chat at the end of the webinar, and we encourage you to complete that feedback survey. Let us know what you thought about the training and also what additional training topics you would be interested in moving forward. So without further ado, I'll pass it over to Yasmin. Hi, Yasmin.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Next slide, please. We can move to the next one and next one. So welcome to Cultural Curiosity for YPAs. I am a credentialed youth peer advocate, and I noticed a void in my training as a YPA on this topic of cultural curiosity, and I'm working to change that as the Youth Workforce Development Coordinator with Families Together in New York State. Next slide, please. Before we get started, I want to just frame out this training. You can think of it as a space to share our collective wisdom with the common goal of offering the best possible care to the communities we serve. So yes, you are learning from me, but we're also going to be learning from each other with sharing out, coming off of mute, what we put in the chat, and sharing our reflections and lived experiences. This training is a container for our growth, reflection, and vulnerability, where we don't assume anyone is speaking with the intention of being offensive or insensitive. So we're kind of just extending that grace and benefit of doubt to anyone here, that even if we don't agree, we are all here with the common goal of providing the best possible care to the communities that we serve. This training is also an opportunity to hold space for in-depth conversations around how we embody the principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion as mental health care providers. These are kind of like lofty concepts that we hear a lot about, that we celebrate diversity and that, we provide equitable care, but we're getting into the meat of what that really means and what that looks like in practice as YPAs. This training is also a place where our inherent value as a team of dynamic service providers is celebrated. We all come from a different backgrounds and have a wealth of knowledge and experiences. So everyone here is encouraged to share with the knowledge that we are welcoming your feedback, even if it differs from the groupthink of this community. Next slide, please. A little bit more about me. I've spent the last 7 years before moving to New York organizing in California, focusing primarily on maternal mental health, racial justice, and equity in the California community college system. I have presentation and facilitation experience at national conferences on topics surrounding equity, diversity, and inclusion. I have lived experience navigating the mental health system as a child of mentally unstable adults and as a consumer of mental health services myself, which is what inspired me to become a YPA, because I never had one of those as a youth. And it inspired me to think about what I could have needed while I was at that vulnerable age. Like I previously stated, I noticed a void in my training when it came to the practical dissemination of culturally competent or curious or humble care. And I wanted to address that in this training, and I'm so glad we're all here on that topic. Next slide, please. So before we get started, we have a lot of ground to cover, and I wanted to just get us on the same grounds of working definition so that when we mention some of these topics, we all have a clear understanding of what it is that we're talking about. So for the purposes of this training, when we speak about racism, we're speaking about a system of advantage based on race. This is a definition that comes from David Wellman. So we're not talking about interpersonal violence. We're not talking about prejudiced actions, but we're talking more largely about the systems that we're engaging in and how they do keep certain groups disadvantaged. When we talk about ego, we're looking at the part of us that controls how we want to be perceived. There is a lot of talk about ego, and if you have strong feelings about this concept, which happens often, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we can expand on that later on in the training when we go a little bit deeper. But for the purposes of right now, we're looking at that part of us that controls how we want to be perceived. We're thinking of this training as a safer space, and this is the idea that none of us can control how safe or unsafe an environment is, but we can work collectively to prioritize each other's mental, physical, and emotional safety. So if at any point during this training you start to feel unsafe in your body or in your mind and you need a moment, please do step away. Feel free to turn your camera off and take care of yourself in that way and re-enter when you feel ready. And if you do feel brave enough to share about where any certain concept or idea shared landed on you, please do share that, because it contributes to our collective wisdom that we're gaining from this training. So diving into this topic of equity, we know it in a social justice framework as this idea that everyone gets what they need. And looking at the image to the left here, where there's 3 individuals, 2 are standing on boxes, 1 is in a wheelchair, 1 is able to see more than enough, right? Can see even without the box. 1 is barely seeing over the fence with the box, and 1 is not even able to access the box based upon their starting point, right? And then the idea of moving to equity, where everyone's getting what they needed. 1 doesn't need a box at all, 1 needs 2 boxes, and 1 needs the ramp to get up, right? So this is our social justice understanding of equity. And I'm sure we've all seen some variation of this picture in the past. I wanted to kind of broaden our understanding of this idea of equity, because in different fields of influence, equity is viewed as the value of shares issued by an entity. So I want to merge these 2 definitions while we walk through this training and think about equity as, if we want everyone, right, every person that we're providing services to, every youth, every family member in the communities that we're serving, we want everyone to get what they need, then we must view each individual as holding an invaluable share of the equity pie. So it's merging the 2 as equity in a social justice sense and equity in a sense of values and everyone getting what they need. And we will dive deeper into this. So if there's not any questions just yet, we can move on to the next slide. And if at any point I'm going too fast, feel free to raise a hand, come off of mute, put it in the chat, and we can address it. Diving a little further into equity, as service providers, YPAs, we have the opportunity to radicalize the way that services are provided to folks. I know many of us here who are YPAs probably didn't have a YPA while we were engaged in services as we were youth, right? And many of the youth and families that we serve have no concept of what a YPA is. So inherently, you are taking up space as a mental health provider, and you are radicalizing the field, because you're not coming in as a clinician, you're not coming in as a med prescriber, you're not coming in as the white coat, right? You're coming in as a peer with shared lived experiences. And this comes with a certain level of responsibility that we need to be aware of. And this can't be done with a significant amount of self-reflection and authenticity. So think about this training as an opportunity for you to self-reflect, for you to dig a little deeper than what may be allotted for you in your normal 40-hour work week. We're mutually exchanging authentic shares of ourselves with our clients. So if it is hope, if it is resilience, if it is strength, if it is joy that has led your healing journey, then lean into this as you're providing services, because you never know in what ways that can inspire and change the lives of the youth that you're serving. And we can only do that if we are reflective and authentic with ourselves in understanding what it took for us to get to this place of being able to inspire people who were in similar positions that we once found ourselves in. Digging a little deeper into cultural curiosity, if you look at this image on the left here, we have one person, a really small person, right? And they represent our own individual life experiences, right? And we have a wealth of these, right? Things that maybe we don't even remember, things that we've never shared out. this is an abundant experience in and of itself, but in comparison to the vast experiences of others, it's minute. And so that is the concept of cultural curiosity that I want us to leave with, is that even though we have so much lived experience and so much knowledge to share through what we've learned and what we've walked through, that we can always remain curious as to what it is that the people around us are experiencing. So I personally define cultural curiosity as the desire to understand how someone's cultural heritage impacts the ways in which they navigate the world. And one way I like to carry this concept out is approaching it through the lens of the wonderment of a child. And I like to think specifically of children around the age of 7, right? Where they still have that purity of their young childhood years, but they have the language and the vocabulary to express their ideas and their imagination a little bit more, but they're not yet maybe exposed to as much as, say, like a 10-year-old preteen, a teenager. And so they're not their images of their worldview is not as clouded by their peers, but that sweet spot of childhood where they can express themselves, but they still have so much to learn. And that is how we can approach being culturally curious as YPAs. We need cultural curiosity because when we're not part of a culture, but assume things about someone based on that certain aspect of their identity, we inevitably set the stage for a sweeping generalization. And I know in my experience professionally working as a YPA, there was an instance where a family had entered into care with immense trauma within the medical system. And working within a multidisciplinary team, people approached this trauma as, oh, that must be because they're part of the Black community and because stigma exists within that community when it comes to mental health care. Not realizing that, yes, that could play a part in it, but this specific family had experienced specific traumas to their nuclear household. And that is what they were entering with, not just the trauma of being Black. Cultural curiosity pushes the needle further away from the idea that any one aspect of identity is a monolithic experience. And we use the term curious because cultural competence is a stagnant and relative term. Relative in the sense that one person's idea of competency is not the same as the next, right? And stagnant in the sense that we always need to remain curious. We always need to remain students of the youth and the families that we're serving. So just because, one youth that we're serving is of the Muslim community, that does not mean that they have the same experience as the next youth and family that belong to that same community. So kind of just approaching every family and every youth that you're working with this passionate curiosity. It also allows for our own adaptability and constant growth. It keeps you on your toes. If you don't walk into a session with a youth assuming that you already know things about them based on their demographic, based on their file, based on their socioeconomic status, then it keeps you in a place where you're constantly developing professionally because you're having to meet them exactly where they are, not just based on the communities that they belong to. Any questions about that so far? And if not, we can jump over to the next slide. So I want to open the floor up now. Please feel free to come off of mute. We'll have a couple minutes to share or share in the chat and continue to reflect, even if we move on past this slide or well past this training, continue to reflect on this. But how do we incorporate cultural curiosity into our practice as YPAs, as mental health service providers? How do we do that practically? Or can you think of a way that you could improve on your sense of cultural curiosity? Remembering that this is a place where feedback is welcome, that being your authentic self is welcome. And that's okay to say, I wasn't the most culturally curious in this situation and I could have done better, because we all get to learn from those mistakes. How do we incorporate cultural curiosity into our practices? I'll start for me personally. I like to ask a lot of questions. If I know that someone belongs to a different faith community than I do, and that leads their life and it's a pillar and a strength of their identity, then I'll ask a lot of questions about that so that within the next conversation, they don't have to explain certain cultural norms to me. Now they've told me and I can understand, and we can go a little deeper into how their faith, for example, leads their mental health. I see in the chat someone says, fabulous book about the system is Invisible Child by Andrea Elliott. She followed a foster family for 10 years. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, we're going to have some time at the end to share different resources and readings. So we'll add that to the conversation then. Thank you. Does anyone else have any input about how you incorporate cultural curiosity into your practice, or maybe ways in which you could be better about incorporating cultural curiosity?
I can share something.
Great.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So in a school setting, just having diverse things in the playroom, right? So having puppets that are multicultural, but even like something that we can improve upon is like our dramatic play area, maybe having a wider variety of foods and like clothing that are more culturally curious and you know to our population, right? So we have a huge French population here, right? So making sure we incorporate those types of foods and whatever clothing that works with that. It's just making sure the children that come in here feel represented in the things that we have in here.
I love that. So even down to the material, sometimes it's not about what we say, but it's about what we present, right? Like we can say that we're culturally curious, but are the materials that we're presenting to the youth that we're serving representing what they're familiar and comfortable with in a way that makes them feel as though they belong in that space? I love that. That's really rich. I haven't heard that one before. Anyone else? We probably have time for one more person to share how you do or maybe could improve on incorporating cultural curiosity into your practice. Thank you so much, Selena.
Just a quick one. That's the reason I put the book in to the chat. Okay, was one of the ways I was actually challenged as a white Jewish person. How could I possibly work with what we do is we work with foster teens that age out of the system, who are not usually white and Jewish. And I was sort of confronted, well, how can you possibly work with someone like that? And I go, education and acceptance. And so that was one of the books that I grabbed.
Thank you so much for sharing that. So you took the time to do your own research, right? And maybe not waiting for an issue to arise or like an obstacle when it came to culture to arise, but doing your own research and educating yourself first. We're definitely going to get more into detail about kind of what Michael has shared, but thank you so much for sharing that. And we can move to the next slide. Perfect on Michael's statement is that we're going to move into this concept of ego and grace, right? So we often think of our egos as something that needs to be villainized. You hear the term ego death, but in this training, I want us to instead think of our egos as something that does not have to be unalived, but it's just a part of ourselves that simply wants to be perceived in the best light. And if we're being honest, we all have that part of ourselves, right? Like we show up, we get dressed for the day, we receive our education, and we come and we serve these communities, right? Of course, we want to be the absolute best YPAs and service providers that we can. And that's not necessarily a part of ourselves that's inherently evil. But what if we shifted toward a culture of alignment between that part of ourselves that intends to show up in our absolute best light, our ego, and how we are actually perceived in the process? So it's this kind of dichotomy between ego and grace, or intention versus impact, right? And if we can just shift to an alignment in between those. So, we showed up and maybe we misgendered somebody and that was really embarrassing. We don't have to kill that part of ourselves that's now cringing because we didn't provide the most culturally curious practices, but we can just move to alignment between the two, right? Like we know where we messed up, or maybe we were called out where we messed up. How can we move to a place where we're now implementing a more culturally curious practice based on that mistake? I do this by extending grace to myself when those two don't align. And I'll do that verbally with the youth that I'm serving, letting them know, like, I'm sorry about that. Like, I didn't mean for that to come out so sharp, or I didn't mean to assume that about you based on your culture. Could you please correct me? Could you please forgive me? I'm going to make mistakes because I'm human. And hopefully we can still move forward and have a therapeutic mentorship even after this experience. And when you name it, when you expose it, when you bring light to it, it allows the youth that you're serving, the families, the communities that you're serving, to be able to do the same. And it leads to a deeper healing that even behind closed doors, now that you've modeled that, they can start to do that within the community, even when you're not there. So I know we had only a couple people that have shared so far, but when you're being vulnerable, right? Like what Michael was saying, that culturally he couldn't relate to the communities he was serving, right? Is there any discomfort that you noticed after you share? Like some people say, share vulnerability fatigue, right? Like, is there any discomfort that you notice after you share out in a group, maybe around people that you're not that familiar with, or when you're just building rapport with a youth and you're getting to let them know a little bit more about yourself? Do you notice any discomfort in your ego after sharing? And what do we do with that feeling? Feel free to come off of mute or put it in the chat. I know that for me, sometimes it shows up as embarrassment if I'm sharing my lived experience because I found it to be professionally appropriate in that moment. I can still feel embarrassed afterward because that's just not who I am anymore, right? Like, I'm sharing something that I've walked through and it's not my favorite memory, but I shared it vulnerably. And sometimes feelings of embarrassment can creep up. So extending grace to that part of yourself, right? That experienced that walked through that, and it's now showing back up and saying, hey, I'm embarrassed. Or, hey, I don't feel comfortable right now, right? Extending grace to that part of ourselves. It broadens the type of care that you can provide because you're able to be more authentic when you show up for yourself behind the scenes. Anyone else ever notice any discomfort in their ego after sharing?
I can share something to that. I think the discomfort for me can come from a place where I feel like I have to educate someone about something like that, where it's, it's different when that's my role, but when it's a setting where people should know these things or should do their own research on these things, it can be a burden, especially like when we're talking about people of color sharing this information, because it's not necessarily new information, it's information that has always been out there. But then there's the burden of the person of color who would have to kind of educate other people about those things. And, that can make, I know for me, sometimes it doesn't make me uncomfortable. It kind of makes me angry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. So sitting with that feeling of anger that you maybe feel in your ego after having to educate, right? What do you do with that?
To check in with myself.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great. So that time, like, just giving permission right now, if you've never thought about these things and maybe you just sit and you white knuckle through that feeling of anger after providing services, this is permission for you to reflect, for you to self-check in with yourself and assess what your needs are. Maybe it's a boundary. Maybe it's like something comforting to you after that experience because you know that realistically you're probably going to have to educate again. Or maybe it's setting a hard line that, no, for my practice, I'm going to need to call a friend and maybe a non-person of color is going to have to answer that question next time. Whatever it may be, this is your permission. This is your formal permission to check in with yourself. As a YPA, to avoid burnout, you're going to need to reflect. Michael, I see you came off of mute.
The YPAs that I work with, okay, I'm going to use the idea, the same thing as when I was sort of attacked at a meeting of social service people, okay, that I'm white and Jewish. Okay, anger was definitely the number one thing at the time, but sort of checking in, I didn't retort angrily. I just explained my background and all the things that I've learned and I'm still learning, and it went on from there. And yeah, we all have a good relationship from that group still. So it worked out
That's
well.
wonderful. Yeah. So just sitting with that part of yourself that's maybe causing other people discomfort, right? And extending grace that maybe they didn't respond to you in the most kind way, but that this is who you are and you're showing up in the field and having the stability within yourself, I want to say, to be able to be called out. We all are going to make mistakes, right? We're all not going to land in the way that we always want to when it comes to working in a multidisciplinary team or serving diverse communities. So do you give permission to be called out, to be corrected? And if not, that's maybe a way that you could be a little more culturally curious. Thank you so much for sharing. We can move on to the next slide. Now that we've gotten a little bit into the uncomfy parts of being a service provider, I want to go a little bit deeper. So this is an activity. Everyone can look at the screen and just reflect on what I'm sharing as you think about sharing out yourself. We're going to use this activity to share influences that have contributed to who we are today. Think about your past experiences, personal learning curves that can be just deeply personal to you or maybe to the culture that you're part of. Hobbies, interests, what you've been exposed to. What are the major elements of your personal story? And of course, this is like a little flower that we're seeing. It can expand, right? And we could probably go all day on all the different aspects of our identity, right? So I'm going to share first on aspects of my identity that I incorporate as a YPA and as a service provider that adds to the depth of what it is that I'm providing, right? And where I can land and how I can show up as my full self. And it inspires youth to do the same. And you never know where these certain parts of your identity are going to land for them. So one is that I identify as a 1.5 generation American. My grandparents immigrated here from the Philippines, but they raised me. So technically they're kind of like parental figures to me. And I noticed that it shows up for me in my services that I provide. And it's something that needs to be addressed because, for example, if I take a youth out to eat and they don't finish what's on their plate and they barely eat it, part of that mentality that I got from my grandparents who were raised in the Depression era Philippines, it's like, whoa, like you need to finish every bite on your plate. But I don't want to project that onto the youth that may have their own things going on, be it eating disorders or just whatever. Like they don't want to carry a to-go box on the bus, whatever it is, right? If we don't address and we don't check these aspects of our identity that show up mentally for us, even behind the scenes, even if we're doing a great job of having a poker face and not showing it, it's going to impact the services that we're providing. So you can share things like this with youth that like, you are 1.5 generation American and you never know where that can land for them, or at least at the very least, just reflect on it so it's not negatively impacting those services. Being not neurotypical myself, having ADD, right? It impacts my workflow and the way that I organize my time, my creative endeavors, and just the way that I see the world. So you never know, even if you don't have to name your diagnosis, like just naming the ways in which you are different, or maybe when you were in school, the way that you tested differently, or the way that you experienced certain aspects of culture and social media, like little things like that. Like, oh, there's this page that normalizes neurodivergence. I found this to be so funny. Like just sharing little things like that, right? If you're able to reflect and take ownership of these nuanced part of yourselves, you'd be surprised at how much rapport you can build with the youth and families you're serving. I touched on this previously before, but faith traditions, right? Like if it is their faith that's leading their walk, or maybe that could be negative or positive, right? Reflecting in the ways in which faith has impacted you. So if it is that you have church hurt and somebody that you're working with is a devout in their faith, like checking that so it doesn't show up. And when they want to talk to you about going to the synagogue or going to the temple or whatever it may be, that you're able to just listen from a place of receptivity rather than your own traumas coming into the surface. Or maybe if they're curious about how it is that you did persevere through certain issues that they're aware of, right? And it is like a faith-based principle. Like a lot of people within the helping professions have faith-based principles of just serving others, right? Sharing that when it's developmentally and culturally appropriate. I would love to hear from others. We don't have time for everyone to share, unfortunately, but please do continue to reflect on these things as they pertain to the services that you provide. But if a few people could come off of mute or even drop in the chat certain aspects of your identity that lead the ways in which you provide services. And I know there's a couple people on here that I haven't heard from yet. So I would encourage you, if you have not yet spoken, even if you're a little shy or you're not in the most quiet place, go ahead and drop it in the chat or come off of mute and share a couple aspects of your identity. And if we don't feel safe to do so, that's fine. But just remember that this is a place where we're not looking to judge, we're assuming the best of others, and we're leaning into our mutual wisdom. I know for me, being a cis woman, working with trans youth, that's an aspect of my identity that needs to be reflected on, right? That there are challenges that they're bringing to services that I cannot relate to on a personal level, but I can empathize and I can do my research and I can be as respectful as possible. But if I don't do those things, then they probably don't feel safe with me and they probably won't engage in services moving forward, or only to a certain extent. because they don't feel understood. I'll give about 1 more minute if anyone else feels comfortable to share. I know we're going pretty deep here, and we did share that this will be shared out, this recording, so I totally understand. I see in the chat, hello, Kristen from Youth Power here. Hey, Kristen. Something I'm conscious about is eye contact. This is so good. Yes. Growing up, there was a large divide in adult conversations and child conversations. Yes, and that can be cultural. So I find it awkward to keep eye contact for long periods of time with fellow peers and folks with some authority or power. That's so good. I can relate to that. Definitely. Yeah. And I know, like, working with youth who are on the autism spectrum, that's not even a fair expectation to have of them. That's not a way that you're able to meet them where they're at. That's not how they engage with the world and with others. So expecting eye contact during a med review, right? Like, if that's something that you're witnessing, which is something I have witnessed in the past, that's not realistic for that youth. That doesn't mean they're not engaged. That doesn't mean they don't care. That doesn't mean they're not taking autonomy and ownership of their care, but it could be cultural. It could be chemical, right? It could be a number of things. So just taking into accountability that even those small mannerisms, right, can have an impact on how we're engaging with youth and families. And that might not even be something that youth and families have language for yet, right? They may just say that you might meet with a parent that's saying they're disrespectful. They're always looking at their phone when I'm talking to them, right? And so that when you reflect on this in your own experience, you're able to advocate even more because you've experienced it yourself, or because right now you're attending this professional development and you're learning, right? Thank you so much, Kristen. And if anyone else comes up with anything I've talked about and asked for you to share upon later down the line, go ahead and drop it in the chat and we'll address it if we have time. We can move on to the next slide. Thank you. So understanding our privilege as service providers, we are not, med prescribers, we're not clinicians, we're not therapists, right? But because we are YPAs, we represent a white coat to a lot of the youth and families we serve. A lot of youth and families have never had a YPA, don't have a clear idea of what it is that a YPA is. Some people might think, actually, if you don't explain it to them, that you're a CPS officer looking to take their kids from them because you are a mandated reporter, right? So just knowing that, like, whatever traumas or past experiences that youth and families are entering into care with, we have a level of privilege, right? And sometimes we have youth and families that are willing to do whatever it is that you tell them to do. And we have to be mindful of that in order to provide equitable and culturally curious services. So I'm going to share a couple things, and if anything lands on you in a certain way, or you have things that you want to share, please feel free to drop in the chat and I can call on you and we can share more about that. So medical violence, it exists, right? And if you're not familiar with that, please say so in the chat. But are we perpetuating it or disrupting it as YPAs, as service providers, right? And one way that we can use our culturally curious approach to disrupt medical violence is, for example, if certain, practices are being suggested, right? But the youth is unaware and just blindly agreeing, we can take a second to say, hey, do you have any questions? Do you understand what they're asking you? Do you need some more information, right? So that it is fully consensual. Dismantling biases, using cultural curiosity as a tool to do this. We all come into care with certain biases intact, right? Whatever that may be. And that's us as service providers and youth and families that we're serving, right? So using and modeling cultural curiosity as we're building rapport, as we're engaging with youth and families, can set the tone for the youth and families we're serving to do the same. If we come in and just wonder, right, and come in with the wonderment of, like, how is it that you interact with the world, or that you run your household, then it maybe can empower them when youth and families come into care, they come into the office or whatever it may be, to start to advocate for themselves with the questions that you're asking them, right? Using that curiosity to dismantle those biases. Intersectionality, cultural curiosity grants clarity as to what aspect of a person's identity you're experiencing at any given moment, right? So, we all hold, like we looked at in the last activity, a multiplicity of identities, and you never know what part of them is kind of like front facing that day. Not just diagnoses, not just race, not just culture, but maybe just like the type of sleep that person got last night, right? we can be curious as to like all of the things that make up who that youth is, right? All of the interests that are guiding their care and that are impacting the quality of services that we're providing. Looking at our therapeutic relationships, though we are not therapists as YPAs, we are mentors, we are therapeutic mentors, and that dynamic is inherently skewed. We hold a certain level of power, right? We hold their files, we hold their treatment plans, we hold their goals and objectives, we hold, you know, whether we believe based on the last session we had, they need to, you know, consider hospitalization or, you know, a change in services. We hold all of that in our hands. And so even though we're not looking to perpetuate violence, though we're not looking to be biased, though we're not looking to harm, sometimes just because the dynamic is inherently skewed, if we're not reflective and we're not careful, we can misuse that power. Establishing trust, being as transparent as appropriately possible. So sometimes, you know, it might not be appropriate to share, you know, all of the details of your lived experience with a youth, right? But maybe just sharing the takeaways of what you gain from that, or the ways in which you can understand and empathize with what they're going through based on your own lived experience. That can be challenging for us to do, but it does establish trust and it builds rapport. So you never know, even if a youth seems to be unengaged on that certain day, because you were open, because you shared, because you took the time to sit with them in their discomfort and in their hard times, that you could be that person that they lean on and call when they are in need or when they are willing to share later down the line. And having that accountability. I noticed in working in a multidisciplinary team previously that it's very easy for us as service providers to look at the ways in which youth interact with different systems and hold those systems' feet to the fire, so to say, right? Or looking at what could have been done better, what wasn't culturally curious, but taking that time, right, intentionally to hold our own feet to the fire and look at what we can do, processing interactions with youth after we have sessions and we provide services, like holding ourselves accountable. What could we have done better? And if there was something that sticks out to you, bringing that to their attention and letting them know that you have enough respect for them to be corrected and that you do take the time, right, to reflect on your own services, that you're not above reproach in that way. I see in the chat, what is medical violence? That's looking back to on our definition of racism, where we're looking at systems. We're looking at the medical system. So traditional medicine, mental health as medicine, right, as a larger system, and the ways in which the system can harm the people that it serves, right? And so that can look like through my own lived experience and working with a certain youth and family that someone went in for a regular checkup, and due to whatever biases and whatever symptoms were presenting that day, immediately took them to a 3-month hospitalization where no visitation was allowed. That was medical violence because the family didn't expect that. It caused harm and separation and years of trauma to recover from, right? And this family didn't necessarily have a say in it, right? Because the medical system had power and were coming in as experts, and maybe were threatening by law if the family didn't comply, that they had to do what was being told to them, that they actually ended up harming the family that they were looking to serve. And maybe that hospitalization did benefit the youth, but it also had residual harming effects. That's just one example. So our application of these practices, it shifts the power dynamics in favor of the client. So I just wanted to name here that as you're showing up to provide services, you are inherently holding a certain level of power, right? If you're in a school setting, if you're in a clinical setting, if you're in a home and community-based setting, you're not just showing up as an informal support. You are a peer, but you're not an informal support. You're part of a system, and this system holds power. So this is just something for us to reflect on. And if there are no questions, we can move on to the next slide. If any questions come up, feel free to come off of mute. Even if we're down a couple slides down the road, feel free to come off of mute or drop it in the chat. So another way that we can incorporate cultural curiosity into our practice as YPAs and just as service providers in general is being mindful of language, right? And that's not just when we're speaking directly to youth and families, but even behind closed doors in service provider conversations, right? What are our ideas? I'm presenting these questions to challenge us and to make us think, but if you have any answers that come up, feel free to drop in the chat or come off of mute. I'm not going to be offended if you interrupt me. What are your ideas around looking kept and presentable? Something in my own lived experience, I have curly hair, and I know people would often say my hair looks wild, crazy, or poofy. That didn't sit right with me. And as a youth, I didn't have the language to name that. I internalized it as something was just wrong with me, right? But what if we just shifted to a place of saying tightly coiled, right? Or, you know, maybe that youth has a certain smell when they show up for services, like just stating they may not have had time to shower today, instead of using any other adjective, right? Just because they're not in the room. The first thing that comes to mind is not always what needs to be shared aloud. And this is with the idea that we're going to get into a little bit later in the presentation, but the notes that you're writing and the ways that you're reflecting on how they're showing up that day, the youth and the families have a right and access to those notes, right? So even if they're not in the room while you're typing out your session notes, or they're not in the room while you're having that conversation, keep in mind that they deserve a certain level of dignity and they can access those notes later. What are your ideas around respectability politics, right? Like, do you believe somewhere deep down, based on your own training, your own conditioning, or ways that have kept you safe in the past, or ways that your elders have tried to keep you safe in the past, that you must show up in the most buttoned up and squeaky clean, tightly pulled back way in order to be deserving of respect, right? And just thinking about serving youth with high acuity mental health needs, that's not always within their range of possibility to show up in the most culturally respectable way. And I'm talking about mainstream culture, right? Sometimes they're going to show up looking a little disheveled, and that's just where they are. But knowing that they chose to show up that day, that is a huge milestone. That is groundbreaking, that they actually showed up, and you built enough rapport and you built enough trust with them. Or maybe their needs were just high enough and they can recognize that now, that they needed to show up for services, even if they didn't have time to get themselves all the way presentable that day. We can approach this by having a lens of appreciation, including the things that aren't as easy to behold or to treat, right? Like if it's just in the youth's personal history that they do have an issue, for example, of wetting the bed, and hygiene and cleanliness is not the top of their priority list because they have a lot of other things going on, we can still show up with a certain level of dignity, respect, and appreciation for them, even though there's a certain aroma coming from them that day. We might have to have boundaries. We might have to build a certain plan into treatment, but that doesn't mean that we disrespect them, even if they're not in the room. Showing up with this level of empathy versus sympathy, that sometimes it's really difficult to behold some of the situations that these youth and families find themselves in. And sometimes that can be, generationally accepted by them. They don't even recognize the problem, but we're never looking at them with pity, right? We're looking at them with empathy and doing everything that we can to bring them to a higher quality of life where they're comfortable and that they're managing their systems and maybe even healing from whatever diagnosis, if possible, right? But never looking down on them, never pitying them, and just kind of putting ourselves in that position that if it was us receiving services and there was a team of service providers meeting frequently to talk about you, how would you want those conversations to sound? Where would you want those words to land, right? That if this youth was in the room, maybe behind one of those windows that looks like a mirror, and they could see and hear everything that was going on, how would your language switch, right? And this is not to shame us, because we've all been in that place where maybe we're not the most aware of the language we're using, or we let something slip out that maybe didn't sound the best. But it's just to encourage you to, one, reflect, and then take accountability for those times when you didn't show up as your best self, kind of going back to that idea of ego and grace. And like Vanessa's saying in the chat, please feel free to chat in your questions throughout the presentation and we'll address them during Q&A. I know I'm kind of like rapid fire, just spitting a lot out at you. That's because I want to make sure we get through all of this and it lands and these are seeds planted for you. And just do not hesitate if you have any questions, you need clarity, or something is not sitting right with you, please feel free to put that in the chat. And with that being said, we can move to the next slide. So like I said, I want to take this time to reflect. This whole training is an invitation to larger reflection. But right now, let's look at a time when someone made an assumption about you that was incorrect. How did you handle that situation? What did it leave you feeling? I know for me personally, I'll share first and I'll give everyone else some time to think and share. by coming off of mute or putting in the chat. But for me personally, I've experienced ageism working as a YPA, that people would say, oh, you look young. Maybe that's why the parent disrespected you during that home visit. You just look young. They probably didn't think you were actually a service provider. Or based off of my faith traditions, people would assume that I'm closed-minded or harmful prejudice toward certain youth that I'm serving, not knowing my own lived experience and the layers of my own identity, right? So these assumptions, they leave me feeling small, they leave me feeling silenced, they leave me feeling invaluable, sometimes unworthy, and questioning with imposter syndrome if I even belong in the room, right? So I'll give people some time to think of a time when someone made an assumption about you and how you handled that, what feelings it left you with. I see Kristen says in the chat, empathy versus sympathy is super important. It's important as a support to identify which one you can use in moments of support, as their experiences peers are disclosing that we may never have experienced in our lifetime, for sure. For sure. And that's great because right in that statement there, we're noticing our own bias, our own culture, and the way that that's impacting the way that we're providing services, right? Kind of like Michael was saying, like if you're white and Jewish, you can't necessarily directly relate to something that a Black Muslim youth is experiencing because your experiences are just different. But just having the courage to navigate that and name those things, right? There's nothing wrong with that. If we are celebrating diversity, that means all opinions, right, need to be at the table. So has there ever been a time, maybe it's just me, where someone misunderstood you or made an assumption about you that was incorrect? What feelings did that leave you with? And just to be mindful, we're doing this with the intention of knowing that the youth and families we're serving are often misunderstood. There are often assumptions made on them that are incorrect based on their diagnoses, based on different cultures that they belong to, based on just engaging in the system in general. Have you ever went to, kind of like from a case management side, went to an appointment maybe at a social services department with a youth and family, and the response that you get as someone who's holding a badge that's from an organization that maybe presents a little different, the response that you get is different than they get, and they're the ones actually receiving services. They're the ones with full knowledge of their needs and their situation. Those are assumptions based on systems, right, that they're receiving that are impacting the way that they're able to navigate the world. So reflecting on the ways that we've been misunderstood and the ways that assumptions have been made about us that are incorrect helps us understand the value and the importance of our roles as YPAs. And feel free to come off of mute or drop it in the chat.
I'll pitch in with the idea that one of our problems, I will use that wording, okay, finding the foster youth that we work with jobs is just the inherent bias against a child being in foster care. That there's something wrong with that child. They're going to steal from me, that type, those are big issues that I have when I'm sitting there with one of the youth and a possible employer going through an interview with them to help them.
Yeah, for sure. So just taking that time to reflect on, at that moment, they're being treated as a number in the system, right? Like nothing personal about it. You are X foster care child, and that means you are X, Y, and Z because of that identity, right? So just taking time to reflect on like how we can combat that stigma. How must that make them feel? How we can incorporate kind of empowerment now that we've seen this oppression, how can we incorporate empowerment into the services that we're providing so that they can one day advocate for themselves? Because we can't make the stigma go away, right? But we can equip them to combat it. Moving on to the next question, describe a situation in which you made an incorrect assumption about someone and what feeling it left you with. And I have a feeling this group is a little tight-lipped. It might be hard to talk about this. So if no one's sharing, just reflect on this, chew on this for a while. I know it's uncomfortable. I know it's hard. I've had a little more time to think about it. So I'm going to share first. And if you feel brave enough to share, then by all means, please do. I know there was an instance where I was working with a youth and she was feeling comfortable with me and she was sharing about her friend group and she had a new partner and she was starting to tell me about this partner. And I asked a follow-up question and I assumed the partner's gender identity. And I immediately caught it. Thankfully, it didn't take me a week until the next session to think like, oops, I did that. And to just say, I'm sorry, I just assumed that your partner's pronouns were he. Are they? My bad. And just naming it, right? Taking quick accountability. Like, we're going to be wrong. I'm wrong almost every day about things. Like, I'm always learning. And that models for the client that they don't have to be perfect, right? Like, it's okay for them to make mistakes too. And that you might be the only person in their life that's giving that messaging that, like, we can make mistakes, we can apologize, and we can move on. And I noticed like her eyes kind of lit up the fact that she saw that, yes, like, I care about, what's important to you and your partner. And she just was like, yes, that's his pronouns are he. And I was like, okay. And we moved on. But now in the future, you have a dynamic where you're able to be corrected. And so when you have to offer some type of correction, it's more welcome because you set the tone for yourself to be corrected. Has anyone else ever made an assumption? I see Kristen in the chat says, I'm learning faith diversity. Being raised Catholic, it was frowned upon to learn about other religions. Sure. So I had limited beliefs as a young child. Once I became exposed to differing faiths and religions through my friends and social media, I became aware of the bias that adults were trying to get me to go along with and started becoming curious and accepting. That's awesome. And see, sometimes it takes for us to be like well into our adulthood to even start to have curiosity, because these ideas of what norms and what's acceptable are so deeply ingrained that we don't even realize it. Thank you for being brave to share that. Yeah. On that topic of faith traditions, I know that kind of like opposite from me, I was raised like within a multiplicity of faith. And so that's something that guides my practice, is that it's easy for me to relate. Like when someone, a youth or a family that I'm working with, when they bring up faith, I can relate on a different level because I was exposed to so many different faiths in my youth. But then there's other things that I wasn't exposed to that, like Michael was saying, I have to do outside reading on. I have to do a lot of research on because I simply wasn't exposed to it. And there's nothing wrong with that, but it just guides the services that you're providing as a YPA. Has anyone else had to have, external learning about certain cultures, or maybe corrected yourself on assumptions that you've made? Or maybe we're all perfect. If anything comes up for you, feel free to interrupt me or drop in the chat, and we can move to the next slide. Okay, so I want to just take a moment to settle on this idea of perspective, right? Like when we're going through life and, we're showing up at maybe 8 a.m. every day, right? And then we're providing services until 5 p.m. And sometimes we have late days, and the caseload is only growing, and we have so many youth with so many needs, and this one needs to go here, and this one doesn't want to engage here, right? It can get easy to kind of forget our why. And I'm sure none of us as YPAs entered into providing services with maybe these little grudges or these little biases, but they can build, this little resentment can build over time. And I'm not talking about anyone here, because I know, no one here will ever do that. But sometimes we forget that we get to serve these communities. We get to have intimate access to the youth that we're serving, not that we have to, right? And I think it's important in the context of power dynamics to remember that sometimes these youth don't necessarily, even if the services are voluntary, sometimes they're not, but sometimes they're receiving pressure from their family to engage in these services. So they don't necessarily have the choice of showing up all the time, but we do. No one's holding a gun to our heads and making us, be a YPA. So we want to show up with that level of appreciation, not just cultural curiosity, not just checking and having accountability, but that level of appreciation that we get to be mental health service providers and we get to have access to them. These youth are trusting us with the most tender parts of themselves. Hopefully, if they trust you and if you've built rapport and if you're a safe person for them, they're trusting you with the most tender parts of themselves every day that you're showing up. Sometimes they're bottling these things up 6 days out of the week, not telling anyone because they don't have anyone they can trust. And they're waiting for the 30 minutes that they're on your schedule to tell you what's been bothering them for years, or maybe all week, to the point that they can't sleep or eat. And we get to have intimate access to them that sometimes nobody else has if they don't have other informal supports, or they've never been modeled in a way of having grace and, offering forgiveness. Like they've never been able to share these parts of themselves, but they do that with us because we're peers and we can relate to them. Having therapeutic access to their lives is a privilege, right? Like I'm sure we've all had youth that we've worked with before, and we're going to get a little deeper into this, but that have entered care with the nocebo effect, which is they're entering believing it's not going to work. They're not engaged. They're tight-lipped for whatever reason. They don't want to talk, right? But when they do open up, like especially if you have a youth that starts that way, and then a couple weeks go by, and they start to tell you a little more about, what made them laugh that day, or like, what bothered them that day, that is a privilege. They don't have to do that, right? They could go through the entire session and just shrug and go back home, but they chose to open up to you, and that is a privilege. And kind of going back to just being mindful of language, especially when you're starting to build that trust and rapport, just remembering to use that strength-based language, definitely to them, right? And we're all trained up, so we should know that using strength-based language helps build trust and rapport, right? But even in the privacy of provider conversations, when you're reflecting on that session, when you're writing your notes, right? Leaning into their strengths, because it is a privilege to have access to them. We can share in the chat if anything comes up for you, and if not, we can move to the next slide. So getting a little bit deeper into how we practice this perspective shift in practice. One thing is, noticing our own triggers and hotspots. If resentment is building, right? How can we address those triggers and those uncomfy feelings that come up during services sometimes? One thing that I do is create a contract with myself, setting clear expectations on how I want to respond, right? If I, got a call or had a meeting or read a file, read an email, and I know that something is going on with this youth and family that may land on me, like I've experienced housing insecurity. So if I know that now this youth and family is experiencing housing insecurity, then I'm going to check in with myself first to see how I'm going to respond and create that contract. So I'm not just coming from a place of being triggered and something's coming out of left field and I didn't expect it. And as great of a service provider as I am, it's impacting the services I'm providing, right? So check in, give yourself that time for self-reflection, and create a contract with yourself. Give yourself, just as we do with the youth, right? Like when we're taking them out in public, we have to set clear expectations on what is acceptable in this environment. Do that with yourself as well, right? On how you're going to respond to this situation or this youth based on the circumstance. Give yourself permission to take the time that you need before responding, right? And this is more in the moment. If you didn't have time beforehand, this is in the moment. Give yourself that permission to just take a breath. Just take a quick breath, especially if we're around youth who maybe like talk really fast. Sometimes we can build rapport with them and talk really fast back, but just take a breath sometimes if you need it, right? Setting this boundary gives the youth the language and an example of how to do that with us, right? That we don't have to just fly through, all of the trauma from the past week. We can take a breath, and sometimes I'll just namely do that. Like, that was heavy. Do you want to take a deep breath with me? Little things like that. It benefits the youth and it gives them a coping skill, but you would be surprised at how it benefits the quality of services you're providing as well. Because like it or not, things are going to land on us. We're not perfect. We're going to get triggered sometimes, and that's okay. Kristen says, thank you for this training. Powerful information being shared today. Okay. See you, Kristen. Thank you so much. I also want us to fill our own cup to prevent resentment. This is like a preventative measure, right? Like if you know you have a day full of sessions or a week with back-to-back sessions, be mindful of that. Like, don't just dive right in, right? Fill your own cup in the way that's unique to you. So at this point, this is deeply personal, and I would love for people to share either in the chat or by coming off of mute. But how can we fill our own cups, right? Like what is refreshing to us, so that we can show up for the youth and the families that we're serving as the best versions of ourselves. And this might not be something, I want us to go a little deeper, like not just getting our nails done, because you can have cute nails and a bad attitude, right? But what is bringing you the most peace? Like how can we really, like, before the week starts, if you start on Monday, what can we make sure that we non-negotiably do for ourselves on Sunday, so that the youth and the families get the brightest version of ourselves, the most present version of ourselves, right? I know for me, like when I was providing home and community-based services, I would have to drive around a lot. And sometimes just driving for hours a day would take me out of my body. I wouldn't be as present, right? So just planning that in between, sessions where I'm driving around for hours a day, Maybe we can have a session outdoor. Like I see Joanna saying nature and no technology, right? And that can be therapeutic for the youth as well. So just intentionally like, okay, this is going to be a day where there's probably like 4 hours of cumulative driving. At some point with the youth or otherwise, we're going to be sitting outside. We're going to get some fresh air so that you can be present, so you can actually listen and not have, you know, your mind racing from someone who just ran a red light and almost hit you, or, you know, whatever it is that's running through your mind. Meditation every day, sure, yeah, just taking that time in stillness, even if you're not like a traditional meditator, right? Taking that time to just sit with yourself in silence, or maybe with like some calming music in the background. You deserve that. And the youth are better for it because you're able to be more present during services, right? Like we can all see 12 youth a day for 30 minutes at a time and call it good, but are they really benefiting? This idea too of letting it pass versus processing over time. Like sometimes there are things that are just uncomfortable and we just have to sit with, and you know, it happened and we can't change it, right? So this idea of sometimes we can use our own coping techniques and let it pass, and we can just simply let it go. And we don't have to carry the burden of that, kind of like Selena was saying earlier, like that anger that comes from having to over explain yourself or educate, right? Sometimes we can just let those things pass. We can set a boundary and let it pass. But sometimes we need to process over time. So I would encourage you, if there are things that are impacting negatively the way that you're providing services, reach out to your supports. Like if you have a supervisor that's you're covering, right, in your organization, it's okay to during supervision say like, something happened 2 weeks ago that I'm actually still uncomfortable with, and it's causing me to hesitate, or it's causing me to, you know, be disturbed even after I clock out. You can say that, right? That's what your supports are there for. And ideally, if you're part of a multidisciplinary team, the team can wrap around you, right? And maybe they can come with you when during the next home visit, so you don't have to feel intimidated or whatever it may be, right? So leaning into those natural supports when you need it, and giving yourself permission to let it pass when that's necessary as well. So just chew on these over time. This is like, it's really dynamic, and it applies to your personal experience and then each individual youth and family and how you're experiencing them, right? But just in order to provide the best possible quality of care as YPAs, chew on these things, reflect on them. Okay, we can move on to the next slide. So like I kind of mentioned earlier, we're going to be digging into this concept called the nocebo effect. It's the opposite of the placebo effect, and it describes a situation where a negative outcome occurs due to a belief that the intervention will cause harm. It's a sometimes forgotten phenomenon in the world of medical safety. The term nocebo comes from the Latin term meaning to harm. So just a practical example of this, you may have worked with a youth, or I know I have just out in the community before, heard this idea that therapy is not going to work. That's for white people. Therapy doesn't work. No, no, no. Or maybe from a faith perspective, therapy doesn't work. Only prayer can fix that. You don't need medicine, right? So this idea that sometimes we're working with youth and families that firmly believe, based on culture, based on whatever training and conditioning, that anything that you do with them is not going to work. Or I had a mother that shared with me, you can bring the youth a journal and a pen, but they've been in therapy for 7 years. They know everything and they're just not doing it. So do it if you want to, right? And so how do you think the youth is going to respond if they hear their caretaker speaking that way over their own healing journey, right? So I don't know if anyone here has experience working with youth and families that have the nocebo effect, but how do we respond when they enter our care with this in place? I'll give us some time to think. You can come off of mute at any time or put in the chat.
I can share. I have a moment of quiet because the kids are not in here, but a lot of the times I go in the perspective of the parent as the expert of their kid, so they can help guide whatever it is that we're trying to work on. But they are the ones that know the most, right? And you're coming from that perspective of curiosity. So that's usually how I go into it, because a lot of them do have that stigma about it, but it's more so like, how do, like, help me help you, right? Tell me this about your child. Tell me their strengths. Tell me the areas of improvement, right? And how can we support you? And kind of framing it like that has always really been helpful when it comes to parents who have that idea.
I love that. Thank you for your feedback. So leaning into the informal supports that the child has as you're getting to know them, there is somebody that knows them better than you, right? And so you might be able to extract some knowledge from that caretaker or support person. I know one time I had a similar situation where I had to ask the parent, like, there's one provider that they spoke really highly of. What was it about that provider that, even though they're not open to, receiving care from me, that provider got them to open up? And we found that it was when this youth was triggered, there was a certain response that provider, responded with, that made the child feel safe enough to open up and engage in services week after week. And that was going to a trusted area, which is their local library. That's like their physical safe space. And then bringing another level, like providing an activity, which was like art with like certain types of pens and colored pencils and paints and things that made the youth feel comfortable again after they were actively triggered. So it's just like, you wouldn't know that, right? If someone just enters with the nocebo effect, but leaning into the supports that are available help you to learn more and combat this effect. I'm going to give another example, and then maybe another person would have some input on how we can combat the nocebo effect. So I had a youth and family enter into care. I was doing an intake meeting, and the mother was cross-armed and just blatantly said, I don't like services. The last person tried to take my kids away with CPS. I almost fought her. We got into a screaming match, and now we're here. So I don't like this. And that's how we were entering care. That's full-on nocebo effect, just namely like, this is not going to work, right? We got to a place of agreement to at least try out this new service that was being offered to the youth. And from there, I took it to be my personal burden to make the process of the next intake session to be as seamless and as comfortable and as family-centered as possible, right? If they're already coming in with this trauma, they're already expecting to be pushed to the side, they're already expecting to be harmed, how can we come from the total opposite side of the spectrum, right? So naming the medical trauma, like that must have been really hard to have the threat of your family being separated after, something as minor as X, Y, and Z. That sounds like it was really hard. I'm sorry that you experienced that. That's not my intention, right? So just naming it, not pushing it to the side, not overlooking it, not gaslighting her, but just naming that was tough. Acknowledging the stress of getting this youth to the appointment, right? Like we may think, okay, we're going to schedule you for next Wednesday at 10, see you there, right? But actually this family has several other kids with all their own individual schedules. They have to make sure they have gas. They have to make sure that like everything is just right so that they can get to the door at 10. What we see as simple, right, can be difficult for them. So acknowledging like, thank you for taking the time to coordinate with me and show up at this time. I know that's not easy. Thank you. And giving detailed instructions on how to find the building, right? So that they can show up and not feel embarrassed and not feel frazzled and not feel lost when they're probably already feeling anxious from engaging in a new service that they have nocebo effect about. So, this is the address. This is an example. This is the address. When you put it into Google Maps, it takes you around the corner. Why don't you put in this address and the parking lot's on the right? You can park right here. You're going to need a access code to get into the door, but hey, I'll wait for you and I'll meet you at the door so you can come right in. Introducing them to the admin person so they don't just feel like they're being gawked at by yet another service provider who doesn't know their story or truly care about them. Introducing them with the warm welcome. Let them know, hey, so-and-so is coming. So, please say hi when you come in. Don't just stare at your computer, but please say hi to them when they come in. This is where the bathroom is. This is where the water is. Do you need a snack or refreshment? Like how would you want services to be provided to you? Like, would you want it to feel stuffy and like you're a burden and like you're walking into someone else's building who doesn't want you there because you're interrupting their workflow? Or would you want it to feel like they're welcoming you, they're waiting for you? This service is in existence to actually serve you and serve you well. Meeting them with that warm welcome and just making sure everyone knows the plan, right? Like, yes, the youth is going to be meeting with X provider, but mom and siblings, you're going to be in my office here, right to the left, and we're going to play games, and it's going to go on for about an hour, and then we'll come back together and reflect, and then you guys can leave. So everyone knows the plan. We're not just looking around, twiddling our thumbs, feeling like a burden and feeling uncomfortable. Okay. We can move on to the next slide. So this idea of counteracting the nocebo effect, I want us to come together for a collaborative brainstorm on it. I have a couple ideas that I'm willing to share out, but I would love for a couple other people to share ways that we can counteract the nocebo effect by coming off of mute or dropping in the chat. I'll begin by sharing a couple ideas that I have. One is, like we've talked about in this chat previously, is just self-auditing, right? Is there ways that like if a youth, verbally or in their file that you're reading, that they've had the nocebo effect and where this is coming from, self-auditing, like maybe there's certain things that you're doing that resemble traumas that they've experienced in the past, and you didn't mean for it to be that way, or maybe it's not even traumatic to the next person, but because of what they experienced, you want to be really mindful of that and auditing yourself in the way that you're providing services, the language that you're using, the places you're taking them, right? Even places in the community can be triggering if you're providing home and community-based services. Building rapport, so they do feel comfortable enough to share with you, like, what's making them uncomfortable. If they are triggered, what's the best way to support them when they're triggered? Like, taking that time. And sometimes building rapport looks like just sitting in that uncomfortable silence. Like, if you work with teenagers especially, sometimes they'll ice you out, and sometimes it's a test to see if you're going to squirm away and end the session. But if they can know that, like, okay, when I get triggered or when I go nonverbal, Yasmin's not going anywhere. She's right here. It's okay to be uncomfortable in silence. It's actually not uncomfortable for me. And sometimes I'll even name that, like, you don't have to talk today. That's fine. I just want to sit with you for a while, if that's okay. Building that rapport, meeting them where they're at, right? And validating what it is that they're sharing. If they're saying, like, my last service provider, I just had to sit in their office for an hour and it was really uncomfortable. They just stared at me and took notes while I sat on the couch. I don't want any white lady just sitting, looking at me and writing in a notebook. I've had someone say that to me, right? So validating, like, that must have been difficult, for you to feel like you don't know what's going into the notes. You don't know what you're supposed to be saying. You don't know if you're safe in this environment. That must have been tough. Hopefully we can build a better relationship moving forward. Validating what they've been through. Enthusiastically welcoming feedback, right? And I can't say this enough, but verbally welcoming the feedback, right? And this is kind of like an activity that I like to do with youth and families that have people-pleasing tendencies too, to increase advocacy as a YPA, is like just allowing that feedback and saying, okay, right to my face, you can let me know right now what's not working for you. What don't you like about these services? What could our team do better? What can we do? What did you not like about the last session? This is about you. These are goals in your own words. This service is about you, not me. So what can we do better? And enthusiastically and frequently welcoming that feedback, because the first time, especially if they have people pleasing tendencies, they might not be able to say anything. So giving them different options on when they can share it and maybe even how they can share it, that encouraging them that they can write in a letter, their mom can write an email, they can text you later if they don't want to say it to your face. Like, just because they might not have the ability at that time to share what it is they have feedback on, that doesn't mean it's not there. So encouraging it enthusiastically and frequently. Explaining treatment, right? Like, sometimes it can be really scary and really intimidating to come into a session and just feel like, especially if you have nocebo effect, like, these people are just gonna pump me with medicine, and if I don't take it, I'm gonna be institutionalized. That's honestly the experience of a lot of youth and families that we serve. So explaining, like, what's going to happen, like, I just want to pick you up. We can go on a ride, go to the park. Maybe we pick up a smoothie. Maybe we do some art, or maybe we play a board game at the office. And the next time you'll have therapy with such and such. And that will look like X, Y, and Z. Just explaining what they're getting into, because a lot of times the services you're providing can be the highlight of their week. So they spend all week ideating and worrying about what's going to happen when they get in your car or when they get in your service, because they don't know you that well yet. And they've had certain traumas within the mental health system. So just explaining clearly, like, what it is that you're looking to accomplish, how it's going to look, and so they can have an idea. And even going back to the feedback, like, actually, I don't like going to this park because this person is there and I don't want to see them. You like, just, explaining it and letting them build the plane with you as you're flying it. And asking clients directly if they're satisfied with services. This can be immediately after, right? Like, how did you feel about today's session? And sometimes, they might come from kind of a skewed place where they're not being completely honest about how they feel about it, or they're just trying to test the waters and say something that kind of gives a shock value type of response. That's fine too. But at least they know when you ask if they're satisfied with services that you care and that it is youth-centered and it's not just about us as service providers. Does anyone else have any other strategies? I know I kind of shared a lot about this nocebo effect. You might not have heard it in these terms, but I'm sure at least some of us have experienced youth and families with the nocebo effect. And just circling back, that's entering into care believing it won't work. So does anyone have any feedback? Feel free to come off of mute or drop it in the chat on how we can counteract the nocebo effect. Be there. Yeah. be present. And like I said, sometimes that can be literally sitting in silence. But you never know, after 10 minutes, that 11th minute of silence, they might feel comfortable to actually share. And that's been me before, as I felt silent. Part of my healing journey has been finding my voice. When I felt silence and I felt like my voice didn't matter, it would literally take me sometimes 20 minutes to say what's on my mind, literally. And so just even if, nothing comes out of their mouth, letting them know that you're willing to be patient, that you're willing to be present, and that you're willing to sit through that discomfort, it builds rapport, even if it looks like there's nothing quantifiable that you can go back and tell your supervisor that happened, right? Counteracts the feeling that the youth trust no one. Yeah, it builds trust. Like, I'm here, And so at least, they can say this and this and this about the mental health system, but they can't say you're not there, right? And just that presence builds trust. Thank you so much for sharing that. Great. If anyone else comes up with anything, it's never too late to share, but for now we can hop over to the next slide. So when you have youth that enter into care with the nocebo effect, but maybe like you're trying to figure out how to counteract it, and maybe they have trust with previous service providers, here are some more ways that you can counteract it. Partner with previous providers who the individual had positive experiences with, if possible. I had this opportunity because we were both within agency, and I was willing to have like a 30-minute sit down warm handoff session. Like, not just the file, right? Not just like, here's who lives in the household, not just here's the age and the gender identity, but like deeply, like, what makes this youth feel comfortable enough to open up? What is the dynamic between youth and mom when it comes to vocalizing needs, right? So if you're able to partner with previous providers, do that. If you're a previous provider and you know that like this youth, like you've told them, okay, I'm discontinuing care, so-and-so is going to be your new YPA, and they're saying, oh, like, I do not want to get more people in my life getting to know me just so they can leave, right? Like if you're working with a youth that is projecting that they're going to be implementing that nocebo effect moving forward as you're discontinuing services, endorse the new services and the program and the provider as much as possible. Let them know that like you're going to do what you can to make sure that they can just pick up where you left off rather than restarting. And, maybe there's things about you that were not a perfect fit for the youth, and the next person, even though they won't be you, they can connect with them in a whole new way, right? And so just encouraging as much as you can that it's good to welcome in new people sometimes, and change is not always a bad thing. Coach the individual on how to advocate for themselves, right? So yes, we can lean into informal supports, but even more so if you're exiting care with a youth, or even if you're just actively in care, teaching them how to name the specific things that work well for them, so that the next provider, or even if it's a different system, or even if it's a decade down the line, they have the language for what it is that they need, right? That's our job as YPAs, to empower the youth. So naming the things, whether it's to a next provider or just in general, like, when I'm triggered, I need X, Y, and Z. Give me my space until I send out a text, and it's probably just going to say hi, but that means I'm ready to engage and you can come pick me up, but not until after 2 p.m. because I'm a little groggy in the morning. Just name those things, right? And kind of role play in that way so that they're able to advocate for themselves. Also using humor, if appropriate, when providing that warm handoff to lighten the mood. Sometimes it can be really hard. Like if you have youth with RAD, or, just abandonment and attachment issues in general, discontinuing care can be really difficult. But just saying like, you would always hate it when I would show up and I would want to like just sit down at the park. You want somebody that's going to run around with you. Maybe the next person will be more, energetic, right? And just like kind of naming the things that maybe the youth didn't like as much about your services, and poking fun at yourself so that they can get excited about a new provider entering their life. We can move on to the next slide. So I know Michael previously shared in the chat, I'm going to go back to it, a book called Invisible Child by Andrea Elliott that follows the foster family for 10 years. I love that additional learning. I'm definitely going to look into that. Some learnings that I wanted to share with you all. One is a book. It's Dr. Joy DeGroo's PhD. It's also in TED Talk form if you look on YouTube, but it's called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome. It's an explanatory theory of multi-generational trauma in the Black community. And I think that it applies specifically to the ways that certain members of the Black community can engage with systems, right? Because we're looking at systems of advantage based on race. So we might not think that race has anything to do with the services we provide, but it shapes just the culture that we're part of in general. So it's just good to have this background knowledge. Another book that I love, it's available on Amazon. It's called Diamond in the Rough. And it is an autobiography from an author who received mental health services throughout her childhood. And it's unique in the sense that the author accessed her own mental health records after exiting care and included them in this publication. So it's going back to that accountability and that strength-based language that this youth graduated care and as a young adult accessed all of her mental health records and redacted some of it, of course, but used it in this publication for like how she was showing up, how she perceived that therapist, how it aided in her care, right? So it keeps us accountable, and it gives you an inside look into, you know, what youth are experiencing as you're providing care for them. So any other feedback? Oh, I see Oprah's book, What Happened to You. Haven't heard of that one. I would love to look into that more. I'm definitely taking notes. Any other ideas on, you know, things we can share for the group to continue this learning and continue this conversation? I know some people have shared podcasts in the past, TED Talks. And just thank you so much, everyone, for your participation. Okay, we can move on to the next slide. And this is my closing slide. So if anyone has any larger takeaways or just themes that they're extracting from this learning, the floor is yours. And this is your time to just open up maybe questions or answers to questions that you didn't feel comfortable sharing before. This is an open floor. And thank you so much for being here.
I'll just say I did appreciate the brainstorming, you know, when we're talking about how to provide. Hold on 1 second, Sayla, 1 second, okay? Just talking about how we're going to approach the family, right? And figuring out you know, detaching the stigma and asking those questions like, what has your experience been like and how can we make it better? And I appreciated that part.
Thank you so much. I know you have a busy day, I can see that, but thank you so much for being here and participating. I do appreciate it. I'm glad to hear that the part about the nocebo effect has been beneficial. I know we spent a lot of time on that, but I received none of that in my training. So I really wanted to make sure I was sharing what I've learned in my own personal practice with you all here. Any other takeaways or themes, questions, comments, concerns? Okay, I totally understand. I used to attend these as a YPA. It's the middle of the workday. Who is Diamond in the Rough written by? I'm gonna put in the chat the spelling of the author's name. Yeah, it's called Dime Taylor, but it's spelled a little differently. Maybe we can go back to the last slide to show what the book looks like. Yeah, thanks. Great. Yeah, I've never seen a book, anything of the kind. So when I read that, I couldn't put it down. Foster youth, therapy throughout substance abuse, and just general mental health. So really great to see the other side of that as service providers. I recommend that to everyone. Thank you everyone so much for your participation and for being here. I hope you gained much. You're so welcome.
So thank you so much, Yasmin. I think there was a lot of really important information that I think you shared, and I think a little bit of a different viewpoint or different way of thinking or talking about some of the things that I think YPAs, but anybody I think doing this work is experiencing. I did very much appreciate the nocebo in particular, because that's a constant, like, how do you relate and connect with the youth and families you're working with is oftentimes something that comes up often, and the challenges around that. And I really appreciated that as a little bit of different outlook or perspective to consider. And some really great strategies that you shared. And so I hope everybody who's on, has found this to be a really beneficial presentation. We will put a feedback survey in the chat. So even if you didn't get a chance to comment during the presentation, I strongly encourage you to and respond to our feedback survey. I think both in terms of this presentation, but what other content would you be interested in hearing more about in our CTAC trainings, both for peer advocates, but also even more generally. Many of these topics are things that we tend to cover, but oftentimes we're always looking for new approaches, angles, or what else we can do to sort of meet your needs. So the survey link is in the chat. Please make sure to click on that when you get a chance and just let us know your thoughts and suggestions for future training. And then can we go to the next slide? I think we just wanted to highlight a couple upcoming events. So on tomorrow, we're doing a training on narrative enhancement and cognitive therapy and evidence-based intervention to reduce self-stigma when working with youth and families. That is tomorrow. And then we also have optimizing treatment for youth anxiety and related disorders over telehealth on November 8th. And just stay tuned. If you go to the next slide, make sure to check out our website, ctacny.org, to view trainings and sign up for updates and event announcements. This presentation, so if you would like to access the recording or the slides, will get posted on ctacny.org in about 2 to 3 kind of business days. And so you're welcome to kind of share that link with others who may be interested in the content as well. And if you have any questions, make sure to email us at ctac.info@nyu.edu. So I don't, and I'm just checking to see if there's any other questions that came up. Yasmin, I don't think we saw any additional questions. So I just wanted to thank you for taking the time to talk with us today. Really appreciate this content, and we're hoping to continue the conversation any way we can. Thank you so much, everybody. Oh, and Yasmin's email, if you want to reach out to her directly, is in the chat as well. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Please enjoy the rest of your day. Take care.